Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Tonight we stay in the ancient world, but we move forward in time. Not far. Less than a century from the last story we told. The last time we were here, we were at Thermopylae. It was 480 before Christ. 300 Spartans were holding a narrow pass against the largest army ever assembled. Greece survived. Persia retreated. Athens built the Parthenon on the ashes of the temples Xerxes had burned. The world went on. But something had changed. The Persian wars had shown the Greek world what was possible. That a disciplined, motivated army, fighting in the right terrain, could defeat an empire that outnumbered it 10-1. The lesson was there, for anyone who could read it clearly enough and was bold enough to act on it. 150 years would pass. Athens and Sparta would fight each other to exhaustion in the Peloponnesian War. The great cities of Greece would bleed through decades of conflict that left them weakened, fractious, no longer the powers they had been at Salamis and Plataea. The Persian Empire would rebuild and endure, still vast, still wealthy, still the dominant force from Egypt to India. And then, from a direction no one was watching, from the north, from the rocky, semi-barbarous kingdom of Macedon that the sophisticated Greeks had always looked down on as barely worth their attention, came a king who had read the lesson of Thermopylae and Marathon, who had studied the Persian Empire the way a hunter studies prey, who had built an army unlike anything the ancient world had produced, and who had a son. The king was Philip II of Macedon. The son was Alexander. Alexander was born in 356 before Christ in the Macedonian capital of Pella, to Philip and his wife Olympias, a fierce, politically brilliant woman from the kingdom of Epirus, who would be one of the most important and most dangerous people in her son's life. He was, from the beginning, a child of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary pressures, the son of a great king, the student of the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, the inheritor of a kingdom that was just beginning to understand its own power. He died in 323 before Christ in the city of Babylon at the age of 32. In the 13 years between his first campaign and his death, he conquered the Persian Empire, Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Bactria, and the northwestern reaches of India. He founded more than 20 cities bearing his name. He never lost a battle. Not once, in 13 years of continuous campaigning across 3 continents, against enemies that included the finest armies of the ancient world. He was 32 years old when he died. Nobody is entirely certain why. Settle in. This is his story. To understand Alexander, we must understand what he was born into, and what his father built for him to inherit. Macedon, in the 4th century before Christ, occupied an ambiguous position in the Greek world. Geographically, it was unmistakably part of the northern Greek world. Its people spoke a dialect of Greek, worshipped the same gods, participated in the same athletic festivals. But culturally and politically, it was something different. Where the great Greek city-states were republics or oligarchies, Macedon was a monarchy, a real monarchy, with a king who ruled by personal authority rather than by the consent of an assembly, whose nobles were companions and vassals rather than co-equal citizens. The Greeks of Athens and Corinth looked at Macedonia the way sophisticated Romans would later look at the Germanic tribes, acknowledging a kinship but maintaining a certain condescension. Philip II changed this. He came to the throne in 359 at age 23, inheriting a kingdom in crisis, attacked on multiple borders simultaneously, its treasury nearly empty, its army outmatched by the professional forces of its neighbors. What he did in the following 2 decades was one of the great feats of state-building in the ancient world. He reformed the Macedonian army from the ground up. The core innovation was the sarissa, an infantry spear that was, depending on the source, between 15 and 21 feet long, twice as long as the standard Greek hoplite spear. Wielded by infantry in a tight formation called the Macedonian phalanx, with the first several ranks leveling their sarissas forward simultaneously, this created a wall of overlapping spear points that no cavalry could charge through and no infantry could easily penetrate from the front. The men behind the front ranks held their sarissas at angles that deflected missiles from above. The formation was nearly impenetrable from the front, which meant that any army fighting it had to find its flanks. And Philip had very good cavalry to protect those flanks, and very good light infantry to prevent the enemy from doing what they needed to do. He also reformed the companion cavalry, the heavy horsemen who formed the elite strike force of the Macedonian army, recruited from the Macedonian nobility, armed with a long cavalry lance called the xyston. These were not skirmishers or pursuit cavalry. They were shock troops, designed to punch through a gap in the enemy line at the critical moment of battle and destroy the formation from behind. Philip taught them to work in coordination with the phalanx. The phalanx fixes the enemy in place, absorbs their attention and their force, and creates the moment, the gap, the exposed flank, the broken section of line, through which the cavalry charges and ends the battle. It was a system of devastating simplicity and devastating effectiveness. Philip used it to conquer Thessaly to the south, Thrace to the east, Illyria to the west. He brought the Greek city-states into his orbit through a combination of military victory, strategic marriage, bribery, and diplomacy, always preferring persuasion to force where possible, but never hesitating to use force where persuasion failed. By 338 before Christ, Philip had defeated a combined Athenian and Theban army at the Battle of Chaeronea and established Macedonian supremacy over the whole of mainland Greece. He was preparing, at the time of his assassination in 336, to launch an invasion of Persia, using the same argument that Greeks had been making for 2 generations. Persia had burned Athens. Persia had desecrated Greek temples. The debt was unpaid. He was killed at his daughter's wedding, stabbed by a bodyguard whose motives remain disputed. He was 46 years old. Alexander was 20. Philip had done something unusual for a Macedonian king. He had hired the finest mind in the Greek world to educate his son. Aristotle, born in 384 in the northern Greek city of Stagira, the son of a physician who had served at the Macedonian court, had studied for 20 years at Plato's academy in Athens, becoming the most brilliant student Plato ever taught, and eventually the most comprehensive thinker the ancient world would produce. After Plato's death, Aristotle had traveled extensively, conducting biological research on the island of Lesbos and developing the systematic approach to knowledge. The insistence on observation, on categorization, on asking not just what things are but why they are, that would define his life's work. Philip hired him in 343 to tutor the 13-year-old Alexander at a sanctuary called the Nymphaeum near the village of Mieza. The tutorship lasted 3 years, and its effects on Alexander were profound and complex. Aristotle taught him philosophy and rhetoric and medicine and biology and the texts of Homer, especially the Iliad, which Alexander memorized and carried with him his entire life, annotated in the margins by Aristotle himself, sleeping with it under his pillow along with a dagger. He taught him how to think systematically, how to observe the natural world, how to reason from evidence to conclusions. He sparked in Alexander an intellectual curiosity that would stay with him across 3 continents, the curiosity that led him to send botanical and zoological specimens back to Aristotle from every new land he entered, that made him interested in the customs and religions of every people he conquered, that gave the Macedonian invasion of Persia a strangely scientific quality alongside its military ruthlessness. But Aristotle also taught Alexander certain things he would eventually have to unlearn or refuse to learn. Aristotle believed that Greeks were naturally suited to rule and non-Greeks naturally suited to be ruled, that the division between the civilized Greek world and the barbarian world was a natural one, written into human nature. Alexander would spend much of his later career acting in direct contradiction to this teaching, adopting Persian customs, marrying Persian women, promoting Persian nobles to high positions in his administration, insisting on a unity of his empire that horrified his Macedonian commanders. The other great influence of Alexander's youth was his mother, Olympias. She was a woman of ferocious personality and genuine political intelligence, deeply devoted to her son and deeply suspicious of everyone around him, given to religious enthusiasms. She kept sacred snakes in her household as part of her religious practice, and capable of extraordinary ruthlessness when she felt her position or her son's position was threatened. She told Alexander in one of the stories that circulated about his early life that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself, that a divine spirit had entered her on the night Alexander was conceived. Whether she believed this or told it strategically, it clearly influenced Alexander's understanding of himself. There was also the horse. When Alexander was about 10 years old, a horse dealer brought a stallion to Philip's court that no one could ride. The horse was called Bucephalus, ox-head for the brand on its shoulder, and it was enormous and black and clearly extraordinary, but it reared and threw every rider who approached it, and Philip was about to send it away. Alexander watched for a moment and then asked to try. Philip laughed. Alexander led the horse toward the sun. He had noticed that the horse was shying at its own shadow, and spoke to it quietly and stroked its neck, and then mounted it cleanly and rode it in a controlled gallop across the field. Philip wept, according to Plutarch. He told his son, "Macedonia is too small for you. You will need to find a larger kingdom." He was right, but it took a few more years to become clear how right he was. Philip was killed in the summer of 336 before Christ at the theater in the Macedonian capital of Aegae, during the wedding celebrations of his daughter Cleopatra to the king of Epirus. The assassin was a man named Pausanias, a member of Philip's own bodyguard, who was killed immediately by other guards before he could be questioned. The motives behind the killing were never fully established. There were personal grievances, and there were political ones. And there were people in the Greek world and the Persian world who had reasons to want Philip dead, and the ancient sources give conflicting accounts. Alexander moved with extraordinary speed. He was with the army when the news came, and within hours he was king. Within days, he had secured the support of the Macedonian noble class and the army. Within weeks, the competing claimants to the throne, potential rivals who could be used as focal points for rebellion, had been eliminated. This was done without hesitation and without apology. It was the way power worked in the Macedonian world, and Alexander had been raised to understand that. The Greek cities, hearing of Philip's death, immediately began to reassert their independence. Athens celebrated. Thebes drove out the Macedonian garrison that Philip had placed in its citadel. Other cities reconsidered their arrangements. Alexander marched south with his army so fast that he was at Thermopylae, that narrow pass where, a century and a half earlier, 300 Spartans had held the Persian Empire, before any Greek coalition could form against him. He marched through Thermopylae without a battle, because no one had time to defend it. He called a congress of Greek cities at Corinth and was confirmed as hegemon, supreme commander of the League of Corinth, the alliance Philip had created. He declared the coming invasion of Persia a war of revenge for the burning of Athens and the desecration of Greek temples. He was 20 years old and had been king for a matter of months. He then marched north because his northern borders were unstable. Thracian tribes in the northeast, Illyrian tribes in the northwest, the kind of perennial border problems that every Macedonian king had to manage before turning his attention elsewhere. He campaigned along the Danube, defeated the Thracians at the river crossing in a battle that demonstrated his understanding of flexible tactics, then wheeled west and dealt with the Illyrians in a mountain campaign of considerable difficulty and considerable success. While he was in the north, a false rumor reached Greece that Alexander had been killed in battle. Thebes rose in open revolt. Alexander marched from Illyria to central Greece in 14 days, a distance of approximately 300 miles through difficult terrain. Arriving before Thebes with his army, before the Thebans had fully understood that he was coming, he offered terms. Thebes refused. He assaulted the city. Within a day, Thebes, one of the great cities of classical Greece, the city whose sacred band had been the finest infantry unit in the Greek world before Philip broke it at Chaeronea, was destroyed. The buildings were pulled down. The population was enslaved. 6,000 people died. Alexander kept the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whose family he admired. Everything else was rubble. The other Greek cities received the news and reconsidered their options. There were no further revolts. In the spring of 334 before Christ, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. He was 21 years old. Before him lay the Persian Empire. The first engagement with Persian forces came almost immediately at the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor in the early summer of 334. The Persian commanders in the region, local satraps, regional governors, with a corps of Greek mercenary infantry and their own cavalry, had taken up a defensive position on the far bank of the river. The Granicus was not wide, but its far bank was steep, and the Persian cavalry was arrayed along the top of the bank, waiting for the Macedonian army to push through the water and struggle up the slope into their weapons. Most of Alexander's senior commanders, including his second-in-command Parmenion, advised waiting until morning and crossing at a point further upstream. Alexander crossed immediately. This was characteristic. the willingness to act at the moment of maximum uncertainty, before the enemy had time to adjust, before his own officers had time to convince themselves that caution was wisdom. He led the companion cavalry into the river himself, on the right wing of the Macedonian line, and the crossing was made under heavy Persian missile fire and the swinging swords of the cavalry waiting at the top of the bank. The fighting at the river bank was fierce and personal, the kind of melee that ancient battles occasionally produced in their early stages before formations could organize and tactics could work. Alexander was nearly killed. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates had raised his sword to strike Alexander from behind when another Macedonian noble, Clitus the Black, cut off Spithridates' sword arm with a single blow. Alexander owed his life to Clitus, a debt that would be settled years later in the worst possible way. The Persian cavalry broke. The Greek mercenary infantry, which had been held in reserve and had not engaged, offered to surrender and was largely massacred, a decision that Alexander made coldly as a message to any Greeks considering service with Persia against him. He marched south through Asia Minor, liberating the Ionian Greek cities from Persian rule as he went, welcoming those that opened their gates, reducing those that didn't. At Gordium, the ancient capital of the Phrygian kingdom, he encountered the famous Gordian Knot. According to an oracle, whoever untied this impossibly complex knot of bark rope that bound an ancient wagon would rule all of Asia. Alexander looked at it for a moment, drew his sword, and cut it in half. Whether this was genius or simply the refusal to accept the terms of a problem he hadn't set, it was absolutely characteristic. The decisive confrontation with the Persian king came the following year, at Issus in southern Turkey, in November of 333. Darius III, the Persian king who had inherited the throne 4 years earlier, and who was, by general historical assessment, an adequate administrator and a poor general, had assembled a large army and was marching to cut off Alexander's supply lines from the north. The two armies met in a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea, terrain that once again limited Persian numerical superiority. Darius commanded from the Persian center. Alexander commanded from the Macedonian right at the head of the companion cavalry. The battle began with the Macedonian phalanx pressing the Persian center and Alexander's cavalry driving hard at the left of the Persian line, and then wheeling left, driving deep into the Persian formation, heading directly for Darius himself. Darius fled, not at the last moment but early, while his army was still fighting, while the battle was still uncertain. He abandoned his chariot and rode away on horseback. He abandoned his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his entire personal treasury in his camp. Alexander treated the Persian royal women with complete courtesy, providing for them, assuring them of their safety, addressing Darius's mother Sisygambis with the respect due to a queen. This was both genuinely decent and strategically intelligent. Alexander was not merely conquering Persia, he was intending to rule it, and treating its royal family with contempt would have made that more difficult. He sent a letter to Darius offering terms. Essentially, Darius could keep what he currently held as long as he acknowledged Alexander's supremacy. Darius declined. After Issus, Alexander turned south rather than east, choosing to secure the coast of the Levant and Egypt before pursuing Darius into the Persian heartland, cutting off the Persian fleet's home ports and preventing any naval threat to his supply lines across the Aegean. Most of the Phoenician cities, Sidon, Byblos, and others, submitted without resistance. Tyre refused. Tyre was an island city built on a rock half a mile offshore, surrounded by walls that rose directly from the sea, defended by the finest sailors in the Phoenician world, confident that no land army could reach it. Alexander besieged it for 7 months. He built a causeway from the mainland to the island, a mole of rock and timber extending through shallow water, gradually approaching the city's walls wide enough to bring siege equipment up to the walls and batter them. The Tyrians attacked the causeway with fire ships and sorties. Alexander rebuilt what they destroyed and kept building. When the causeway reached the island and breaching engines were brought up against the walls, Alexander took the city by assault in the summer of 332. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The causeway he built still exists, 2,500 years later, connecting the former island to the mainland as a permanent peninsula. Gaza fell after a 2-month siege. Then Alexander entered Egypt. Egypt received him as a liberator. The Persians had ruled Egypt for more than a century, suppressing its traditional religion and culture with a heavy hand that had generated deep resentment. Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a successor to the pharaohs. He traveled to the ancient capital of Memphis and performed the rituals required of an Egyptian king, sacrificing to the Egyptian gods, paying respect to the sacred Apis bull. The Egyptians, pragmatic about rulers and preferring a distant king who respected their traditions to a present one who did not, accepted him. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt that would bear his name, Alexandria. He chose the site himself, sketching the layout of the city in grain on the ground. A city that would, within a century, become one of the largest and most important cities in the ancient world, home to the greatest library ever assembled, the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. Then he made the journey that no military logic required and that he had apparently felt compelled to make from the moment he entered Egypt, a 3-week march across the Sahara Desert to the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle of the god Amun was located. No large retinue, just Alexander and a small group of companions, following guides through the desert, reportedly saved from dying of thirst by a miraculous rainstorm, and guided through the trackless sand by a pair of crows. At Siwa, Alexander consulted the oracle privately. He never told anyone what he was told or asked or heard. What he did tell people afterward was that he had received the answer he was hoping for. The priest of Amun reportedly addressed him as the son of the god, a son of Zeus in the Greek understanding of the same divine principle. Alexander left Egypt in the spring of 331 and marched east toward the Persian heartland and toward Darius. The final confrontation came at Gaugamela, on a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq, in October of 331. Darius had chosen the ground carefully, a wide, open plain with no natural features to limit his numerical advantage, terrain that he had reportedly had leveled further to smooth the movement of his scythed chariots. He had assembled an enormous army. Herodotus-style numbers in the ancient sources are almost certainly exaggerated, but the Persian force was very large and included cavalry from every corner of the empire, war elephants from India, the scythed chariots, and a reconstituted infantry corps. Alexander had perhaps 47,000 men. The Battle of Gaugamela is one of the most analyzed military engagements in history. What Alexander did was both brilliantly simple and extraordinarily risky. He refused to attack where Darius expected him to attack. He obliqued his entire line to the right, drawing the Persian left flank forward in pursuit, gradually opening a gap in the Persian center. Then, at the precise moment when that gap was large enough, and the Persian line had been disrupted enough by the movement and the fighting on the flanks, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a direct charge. The hammer blow, the wedge driven into the gap, heading again directly for Darius. Darius fled again. As at Issus, the Persian king abandoned his army while it was still fighting. His flight broke the morale of the center, and the battle dissolved into a rout. Darius escaped east. Alexander did not immediately pursue. Part of his army was in serious difficulty on the left wing, engaged with Persian cavalry that had broken through, and he turned to help before the pursuit. It was the only moment of the battle where Alexander's decision was clearly suboptimal. Darius survived Gaugamela, but the Persian Empire did not. Its heartland was open. The great cities, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, lay undefended before the Macedonian army. Babylon surrendered without a siege. The city, one of the ancient world's great metropolitan centers, with its famous hanging gardens and its massive ziggurat and its population of hundreds of thousands, opened its gates to Alexander in late October of 331. He entered in procession, the Babylonians lining the streets, the priests of Marduk performing the rituals that had for millennia welcomed new kings to the city. Alexander sacrificed to Marduk and ordered the restoration of temples that the Persians had damaged or neglected. Susa, the Persian administrative capital, fell next. Its treasury, gold and silver accumulated over 2 centuries of empire, was so vast that it took 10,000 pairs of mules and 5,000 camels to carry it away. Alexander distributed much of it to his army. Some estimates of the treasure seized at Susa and Persepolis together suggest it exceeded the annual revenue of the entire Greek world. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the palace complex that Darius the Great had built over a generation to embody the grandeur of Persian royal power, fell in January of 330. Alexander let his troops plunder it, an act he apparently chose deliberately as the symbolic fulfillment of the revenge for Athens. Then, at a drinking party some months later, he burned it. The ancient sources debate whether this was a calculated political decision, the symbolic end of the Persian Empire, the act that released him from the obligation of revenge and allowed him to present himself as the legitimate Persian king rather than its destroyer, or whether it was a drunken impulse encouraged by an Athenian courtesan named Hyphasis, who urged him to give the assembled company the pleasure of setting fire to the halls of Xerxes. Probably both things were true simultaneously. Alexander was 25 years old and had just conquered the largest empire in the ancient world. He was entirely capable of making a calculated political decision at a drinking party. Darius, meanwhile, was fleeing east. Alexander pursued him with characteristic speed, covering ground at a rate that kept his quarry perpetually just ahead. Then, in the summer of 330, Persian nobles in Darius's own entourage, calculating that a dead king was more useful to them than a living one who might make peace with Alexander on terms they disliked, stabbed Darius and left him dying in a cart. Alexander arrived to find the Persian king still alive. Barely. He removed his own cloak and covered Darius with it. Darius died shortly after, possibly in Alexander's presence. Alexander gave him a royal funeral, performed with Persian ceremonial at Persepolis. He was not Darius's murderer, and he was going to be Darius's successor. And both of those things required the proper burial of the man whose empire he had taken. The murderers, Bessus, a Persian noble who had declared himself the new king under the name Artaxerxes V, were pursued into Bactria, the Central Asian region that is now Afghanistan and the surrounding territories. Alexander spent the next 3 years in Bactria and Sogdia, the most difficult campaigning of his career. Not great pitched battles on flat plains where his tactical genius could decide things in an afternoon, but guerrilla war in mountain terrain against enemies who faded into the hills when he advanced and reappeared when he withdrew. He founded cities, garrisoned towns intended to hold the conquered territories, scattered across the landscape of what is now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. He married Roxane, the daughter of a Bactrian noble, in 328. It was, by Greek and Macedonian standards, an improbable marriage, a Macedonian king marrying a barbarian princess rather than a Greek or Macedonian aristocrat, and it caused murmuring among his commanders. Alexander did not care. It was also during the Bactrian campaigns that the tensions within his court reached their most dangerous point. Alexander was changing. The man who had left Macedon in 334 had been, by any measure, a Macedonian king, leading a Macedonian and Greek army on a Greek national mission. The man who emerged from Bactria was becoming something else, an Eastern king, a universal ruler, a man who adopted Persian court dress and Persian ceremonial, and who expected increasingly the kind of deference that Persian kings received and that Macedonian nobles were entirely unaccustomed to giving. At a banquet in Maracanda in 328, after an argument that had been building for years, Alexander killed Clytus the Black, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus River, his oldest cavalry commander, a man who had known him since childhood. The argument was about Alexander's increasing identification with Persian customs and divine status. Clytus said things that could not be unsaid. Alexander threw a spear through him. He spent 3 days in his tent afterward, refusing to eat, refusing to see anyone, in a state that the ancient sources describe as inconsolable grief. His philosophers eventually talked him out of it. He resumed the campaign. In the spring of 327 before Christ, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains into India. He was 28 years old. He had been campaigning continuously for 7 years. His army had marched more than 11,000 miles since crossing the Hellespont. The invasion of India was not by any rational strategic calculation necessary. Bactria was secure. Persia was administrated. The empire was large enough. Alexander's generals, his companions, the men who had followed him from Macedon, who had watched him grow from a 21-year-old king into whatever he was now, were exhausted and wanted to go home. Their wives and families were back in Macedon. They had been away for years. They had enough gold. They were tired. Alexander did not care. He was moving east because there was east to move into, because the edge of the known world was somewhere beyond the next mountain range, because the model he had fixed for himself, Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, the man who chose a short, glorious life over a long, undistinguished one, demanded that he keep going until there was nowhere left to go. He crossed the Indus River. He fought the king Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326, one of the most difficult engagements of his career, against war elephants that the horses of the companion cavalry refused to approach in monsoon conditions across a flooded river in the night. He crossed upstream from Porus's position in darkness, in a thunderstorm that covered the sound of the crossing. He won the battle, captured Porus, and then did something characteristic. He returned his kingdom to him. Porus had fought well and was too useful and too proud to make into a subordinate in the conventional way. Better to keep him as a partner. After the Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to keep going east. Somewhere beyond the next river, the Hyphasis, lay the Ganges plain and the great kingdoms of the eastern Indian subcontinent. Alexander wanted to reach what his geographers told him was the edge of the world ocean, the great sea that bounded all lands. His army refused. This had never happened before. In 7 years of continuous campaigning, through the deserts of Egypt and the mountains of Bactria and the monsoon rains of India, through homesickness and exhaustion and the deaths of friends and the sense that the world was getting further and further from home, the army had followed him. Now, at the Hyphasis River in the summer of 326, they stopped. The senior officers came to him and told him, as respectfully as they could, that the army would go no further east. The men would follow him south to the ocean to complete the circuit of the campaign and find a way home. They would not go east. Alexander went to his tent and stayed there for 3 days. The same retreat he had used at the Hydaspes crossing, the same retreat he had used after killing Clytus. He was waiting for them to change their minds. They did not. He came out and announced that the army would turn back. He established altars on the east bank of the Hyphasis, 12 giant altars to mark the easternmost point of his campaign, and the army turned south. The return journey was catastrophic in ways that the eastern campaigns had not been. Alexander led the army south to the mouth of the Indus through a series of battles against Indian tribes, personally leading assaults, personally scaling walls, personally doing things that a commander should not do if he wishes to stay alive. At a town of the Mali people, he was struck by an arrow that pierced his lung. For several days it was not clear he would survive. He recovered. He never explained why he had climbed that wall himself. The worst came in the Gedrosian desert, the bone-dry wasteland of what is now southern Pakistan and eastern Iran, through which Alexander chose to lead the bulk of his army on the return from India. His admiral Nearchus was taking the fleet west along the coast. The land army, crossing the Gedrosian desert in the summer heat, ran out of food and then water. Thousands died. The ancient sources describe scenes of soldiers drinking brackish water and dying from it, of camp followers and baggage animals dying by the thousands, of men walking until they fell and were left where they lay. It was the greatest disaster of Alexander's career, and it was entirely self-inflicted. The route through the Gedrosian was known to be brutal, and there were better alternatives. Why he chose it is unclear. Perhaps he wanted to match a legendary achievement of the semi-mythical Queen Semiramis, who had reportedly crossed the same desert. Perhaps it was the same impulse that had driven him up the walls at the Mali town, the need to do the impossible thing, to test himself against the hardest possible obstacle, to prove something that could not be proven any other way. The army that emerged from the Gedrosian desert into Carmania in late 324 was a fraction of the force that had entered it. Alexander held a week of festivals and celebrations, distributing gifts and organizing athletic competitions. Then he marched west. In 323 before Christ, Alexander was in Babylon. He had been planning his next campaign. The Arabian Peninsula, which lay south of Mesopotamia, was largely unknown to the Greek world and had never been conquered by anyone. Alexander had sent reconnaissance expeditions along the Arabian coast. He was building a harbor at Babylon large enough to support a fleet for the circumnavigation of Arabia. He had grand ambitions. Some ancient sources mention a plan to continue west after Arabia, to North Africa, to Carthage, to the western Mediterranean, the kind of ambitions that a man of 32 who had never been stopped might reasonably entertain. In June of 323, Alexander attended a banquet given by a Macedonian noble named Medius of Larissa. He drank heavily. He had been drinking more heavily in the last few years, a pattern that his court had noticed and worried about. He went to bed that night apparently well. The next day he had a fever. The fever lasted 11 days. It did not break. On the 11th day, the 10th of June, 323 before Christ, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He was 32 years old. The cause of death has been debated for 2,000 years by ancient historians and modern ones, by physicians and classicists and conspiracy theorists. The ancient sources suggest typhoid fever, complicated by the lung wound from India and by years of heavy drinking. A 2019 medical analysis proposed that he may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological condition that can follow a typhoid infection and that causes ascending paralysis, which would explain the ancient source's description of his body being remarkably well preserved after death, because he may not have been dead as long as everyone thought before burial was arranged. Poison has been suspected since antiquity. The most frequently named suspects are Antipater, the viceroy he had left in Macedon during his eastern campaigns, and Antipater's son, Cassander. The poison would have been a preparation from the Styx River in Arcadia, a river whose waters were said to be deadly. Modern analysis of possible sources for such a poison suggests it could have been a preparation of the plant Veratrum album, white hellebore, whose effects are consistent with what the ancient sources describe. We do not know. We will probably never know. What we know is that on the evening of the 9th of June, 323 before Christ, a line of Macedonian soldiers was admitted to his chamber to say farewell. They filed past him where he lay unable to speak, able only to lift his head slightly and acknowledge their passage with his eyes. They filed past in silence, the men who had followed him from Macedon to India and back. Whatever was in their faces as they passed is not recorded. He was asked, before he lost the ability to speak entirely, to whom he left his kingdom. He said, to the strongest, or possibly to the best. The Greek word can mean either. His companions asked when they should perform the honors due to a great king. He said, when you are happy. He had no legitimate heir. His wife Roxane was pregnant. The child, Alexander IV, would be born after his father's death and would be murdered at age 13. His empire, the largest the ancient world had yet seen, was divided among his generals, the Diadochi, the successors, who spent the next 40 years fighting each other for pieces of what had been one man's domain. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last 300 years, ending with Cleopatra. Seleucus took Persia and Mesopotamia. Antigonus and his descendants took Macedonia and Greece. The Hellenistic world, Greek culture spread across an enormous arc from Egypt to India by Alexander's campaigns, would endure for 3 centuries until Rome absorbed it piece by piece. The cities Alexander founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria Escate at the eastern edge of his empire, dozens more scattered across the landscape from Turkey to Afghanistan, became centers of Greek culture, Greek language, Greek thought in the middle of lands that had never been Greek before. The Library of Alexandria, founded by Ptolemy but owing its existence to Alexander's conquest of Egypt, would become the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, the place where Euclid worked out the principles of geometry and Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. The Greek language Alexander spread, through conquest and through the cities he founded, became the lingua franca of the educated ancient world, the language in which, 3 centuries later, the books of the New Testament would be written. The world Alexander made is still, in ways difficult to trace precisely, the world we live in. It is late now. Close your eyes. Let Alexander rest, the boy who tamed the horse no one else could ride, who slept with Homer under his pillow and a dagger beside it, who wept at 25 when he read about Achilles because he feared he would not be as famous, who crossed the Hellespont at 21 and never crossed back, who stood at the Hyphasis river and looked east at a world that was still uncrossed and heard his army say no for the first time, and went back to his tent for 3 days, and came out and turned south, who lay in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon at 32, unable to speak, lifting his eyes as his soldiers filed past. Let the companion cavalry rest, the Macedonian nobles who had followed him from Pella to Persepolis, to the banks of the Indus, who had charged at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, who had watched him change from a Macedonian king into something that had no name in the world they had grown up in, who had gone to his tent at the Hyphasis river and told him the army would go no further, who filed past him in Babylon in the silence of men who know what they are looking at for the last time. Let Darius rest, the Persian king who fled at Issus and Gaugamela, who was murdered by his own nobles rather than captured by his enemy, who died with an enemy's cloak over him and received a royal funeral from the man who had taken everything from him. He was not a great king. He was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The Persian Empire would have fallen to someone eventually. It happened to fall to Alexander. Let Roxane rest, the Bactrian princess who married the conqueror of the known world in a foreign land, who bore his son after his death, who watched her son murdered when the boy was 13, who was herself murdered not long after. She had very little say in any of it. Let Hephaestion rest, Alexander's oldest friend, the man who had been beside him since childhood, the companion whose death in Ecbatana in 324, a year before Alexander's own, broke Alexander in a way that no defeat in battle had. Alexander went into mourning for months, ordered the mane and tail of every horse in the army cut as a sign of grief, had Hephaestion's doctor executed for failing to save him. The depth of the grief suggests the depth of the friendship. What it was precisely we cannot know. It was, by any measure, the most important relationship of Alexander's life. Let the cities rest. The Alexandrias scattered across the landscape from Egypt to the edges of India, most of them ruins or buried now, a few of them still carrying versions of the name, the bones of the foundations there under the soil of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan and Pakistan, in places that were changed by his passage and are still, in ways nearly impossible to trace, different because he came through. Let Babylon rest. The city that welcomed him as a liberator, that he planned to make the capital of his empire, that he was planning to drain and rebuild when he died. The city where Nebuchadnezzar had held the Jewish captivity, where the Tower of Babel may or may not have stood, where Alexander sat in the heat of a Mesopotamian June with a fever that would not break. The city is dust now under the Iraqi plain, archaeologists finding the foundations of the palace rooms where he spent his last days. He asked his friends when they would honor him properly, and he said, "When you are happy." They were not happy for a very long time. The world he had made did not hold together. The men he had trusted fought over it for 40 years, and their children fought over the pieces, and Rome eventually absorbed what remained. The world moved on, as worlds do, but the language he spread endured. The cities endured. The curiosity, the compulsion to go east, to go further, to find out what was on the other side of the mountain, endured. Something passed through the world in those 13 years between the crossing of the Hellespont and the death in Babylon, something that did not vanish when Alexander did. Let the long, strange light of that ancient world drift away. Let the fires go out across the plain of Gaugamela, across the walls of Persepolis, across the banks of the Hyphasis, and sleep.